The question didn't come from cruelty. It came from shock. And in that room, a $40 million penthouse sitting above Seoul like a throne above the clouds. Shock was something no one had ever seen on Kwon Jae-won's face before. Not when his father was assassinated. Not when he buried his only brother. Not even when the government froze $2 billion of his assets and he sat across from the prosecutor, smiled and said, "Try harder." But tonight, he was staring at Adaeze Okonkwo, 55 years old, achingly beautiful, composed like a woman carved from dignity itself. And his jaw had gone completely still. The dinner table seated 12 of the most dangerous men in South Korea. Mafia lieutenants, shadow politicians, corporate wolves in Italian suits. Not one of them had dared to speak for a full 30 seconds, because the woman had just confirmed what none of them believed possible. She had never been touched. Not once. Not ever. She'd said it with her chin raised, her dark eyes locked on Kwon Jae-won like she was daring him to say the wrong thing. Like she knew how this world worked, and had already decided she didn't belong to it. She'd said it because his second-in-command, Park Seung-ho, drunk on $3,000 whiskey and bruised ego, had sneered at her across the table. What exactly has a woman like you been saving yourself for? A king, a god? Or are you just broken? The insult landed like a slap. But Adaeze hadn't flinched. She'd set down her wine glass, slowly, deliberately, looked at Park Seung-ho with the kind of calm that only comes from surviving real pain, and said, "Neither. I've been waiting for a man worth the wait. And looking around this table, I'm starting to understand why the wait isn't over." Silence. Then Kwon Jae-won had leaned forward, dark eyes unreadable, voice low as a midnight threat. "You're still a virgin at 55? And the room went silent, not because of the question, but because of how he asked it. Not with mockery, not with disbelief. With something that looked terrifyingly close to reverence. 3 weeks earlier, Adaeze Okonkwo had been standing in a boardroom in Lagos, watching the last thing she'd built with her own hands get swallowed alive. Okonkwo Heritage Textiles, her family's company. 70 years old. Her grandfather's blood was in those walls. Her mother had woven the first fabric on the ground floor before the building even had a second story. And now a Korean conglomerate called Kwon Empire Group had just bought their $200 million debt overnight and was sending a representative to negotiate a restructuring. Everyone around the table assumed restructuring meant termination. Adaeze had spent the night before the meeting on her knees, not begging, praying. There was a difference she'd spent her whole life understanding. She walked in the next morning in a deep burgundy suit. No jewelry except her mother's gold earrings, the ones her mother wore the day she started the company with nothing but fabric, faith, and fury. The representative from Kwon Empire walked in 20 minutes late. He was young, arrogant. He barely looked at her. He slid a document across the table. Adaeze read it in 90 seconds. Then she closed the folder and said, "This isn't a restructuring proposal. This is a burial notice with a bow on it." He blinked. "Excuse me. You're offering us 12 cents on the dollar. You're replacing our entire management team with your people. You're stripping our brand name and merging our archives into your fashion arm. You're not saving us. You're harvesting us. Madam, with all due respect, my name is Dr. Adaeze Okonkwo. I have a PhD in international business from Oxford and 2 master's degrees. The next time you enter a room where I'm seated, you'll address me properly, or you won't address me at all." The temperature in the room dropped 6 degrees. He made one phone call that afternoon, to Kwon Jae-won himself. Jae-won had been in the middle of a fencing match when the call came. He didn't stop. He finished the round, removed his mask, and listened to his representative stammer through what had just happened in Lagos. When the call ended, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Cancel the acquisition. I want to meet her." His assistant looked up from her tablet. "Sir?" "Fly her to Seoul. First class. Tell her, it's a negotiation she can't afford to miss." He put the mask back on and resumed the match. But something had shifted behind his eyes. He'd made his fortune by being the most dangerous person in every room he entered. He'd destroyed companies, corrupted senators, and once sat through a 4-hour assassination attempt without breaking a sweat. But a 55-year-old woman in Lagos had just told his representative to learn her name. And Kwon Jae-won had felt something he hadn't felt in 40 years. Curiosity. Adair's almost didn't come. Her younger sister Chisholm had begged her not to. Ada, these people are not ordinary businessmen. Kwon Jae-won is not a person you negotiate with. You either serve his interests or you become his next lesson. Adair's had looked at the photo of her grandfather on the wall, the one where he was young and bold and holding up the first bolt of a conquo fabric like it was a flag. And she'd said, "Then I'll make sure the lesson is mutual." Seoul hit her like a second heartbeat. The city was cold, clean, electric. Everything moved like it was in a hurry to become something greater. She understood that urgency. She'd felt it her whole life. They put her in a hotel that didn't have a price list because people who needed to ask the price didn't stay there. That evening, an envelope arrived. Inside, an invitation to dinner. No address. Just a car that would come at 9. She wore black, simple, silk. Her grandmother's gold bracelet on her right wrist. When she walked into the penthouse and saw the 12 men seated at the table, she understood immediately that this was not a business dinner. This was a test. She walked to her seat, the one directly across from Kwon Jae-won, and sat down like she'd been sitting at dangerous tables her entire life. Because she had. Kwon Jae-won was 61 years old and looked 50. Not because of vanity. He simply hadn't let time win. He was lean and angular, with a jawline carved from stubbornness and silver threading through his black hair like war medals. His eyes were dark, not cold, not warm but watchful. The eyes of a man who had learned that the second you stopped watching was the second everything collapsed. He had never married. This was the scandal that Seoul society never tired of. His mother had chosen 3 women for him over the decades, each one beautiful, each one from the right family. Each time Jae-won had looked at the woman across from him, seen everything that was correct about her, and felt nothing that mattered. He'd had relationships, brief ones, controlled ones, women who understood that his empire came first and his heart was a room he'd locked at 23 and never reopened. At 23, he'd watched the woman he loved choose his father's money over his soul. Her name was Song Yoo-jin, and she had taught him the most important lesson of his life, that love without loyalty was just performance. He'd never gone looking for it again. Until now, across a dinner table in Seoul, a Nigerian woman with her grandmother's gold bracelet was talking back to his most feared lieutenant, like she'd done it 1,000 times before. He watched her the entire evening, not her beauty, though it was remarkable, the kind of beauty that doesn't announce itself but simply sits there, unavoidable. He watched her precision, the way she chose which battles to enter and which to leave alone, the way she listened twice as long as she spoke, the way she held her glass, never sipping when someone wanted her nervous, always sipping when someone wanted her controlled. She was extraordinary. And when Park Sung-ho made the disgusting comment and she delivered her response, quiet, devastating, surgical, Jae-won felt something crack open in his chest. After his own question, the one that silenced the room, she'd looked at him directly and said, "Is that going to be a problem for the negotiation?" He'd almost smiled. Almost. The other men left, slowly, reluctantly, watching Jae-won watch her. He asked her to stay. She said, "Give me one reason that serves my interests." He said, "I'll give you back your company." The silence between them was different now. Not hostile, not comfortable, something in between that had no name yet. She sat. He poured her tea. Proper Darjeeling, she noticed, not Korean tea, which meant he'd done his research. "You had your assistant find out what I drink," she said. "I find out everything about the people I invite into my home. Then you already know my answer to the original question. I know the fact. I want to understand the reason. She looked at him for a long moment. Why? Because in 61 years, I have never met a person with that kind of discipline, and in my world, discipline is the rarest currency there is. Something passed across her face, not flattery received. She'd been flattered by powerful men her whole life. This was different. This was being seen. She set her cup down. My mother told me one thing before she died. She said, "Ades, don't give yourself to anyone who doesn't understand what they're receiving." I watched men come and go. I watched them choose convenience over character. And I chose to wait. For what? Her eyes met his. For something real. Jae-won was quiet for so long she almost stood to leave. Then he said very quietly, "I stopped believing real was possible at 23. What happened at 23? He looked out at the Seoul skyline, 1,000 lights burning below like fallen stars. I loved someone. She chose safety over me. I chose power over healing. And by the time I realized I'd built an empire to fill a room inside me that only needed one person, it was too late to remember who I was before the empire. Ades didn't say anything. She just listened. And for Kwon Jae-won, that silence was more intimate than anything he'd experienced in 40 years. 3 days into her stay in Seoul, during which Jae-won had given her access to his legal team and quietly begun undoing the acquisition, Ades got a call from Chisholm in Lagos. "Ada, something is wrong. Someone is buying up shares in the company using a shell corporation. Different name, different country, but I ran the numbers. It traces back to a Korean firm called PSH Holdings." Ades went cold. PSH Holdings. Park Sung-ho. She confronted him the next morning in Jae-won's office building. In the lobby, public, deliberate. No room for denial. "You're running a shadow acquisition behind your boss's back." Park Sung-ho smiled, the thin, dangerous kind. "Go home, African woman. You have no idea what room you've walked into." "I know exactly what room I've walked into. The question is whether your boss does." "Jae-won trusts me with his life. You've known him 5 days. Who do you think he believes?" Ades looked at him without blinking. Men who do things in the dark always believe the dark protects them. It doesn't. It just delays the light. She went straight to Jae-won. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he closed his laptop and said, "Show me the documents." She showed him. He looked at them for a long time. Then he picked up his phone, made one call, and said 4 words. "Bring him to me." What happened in that room between Jae-won and Park Sung-ho? Ades never fully knew. She waited in the hall outside and for 20 minutes, nothing but silence. Then a sound she couldn't identify. Then more silence. When the door opened, Sung-ho walked out with his jaw tight and his eyes red. He passed her without a word, but he paused, just for a moment, and said, so quietly only she could hear, "He's never looked at anyone the way he looks at you. Don't waste it." Then he was gone. Jae-won came to the doorway. His knuckles were split. She looked at his hand. He looked at her, looking at it. "He didn't just betray me," Jae-won said. "He'd been planning it for 8 years. He was the one who had my brother killed." The words landed like stones dropped from the sky. Ades didn't reach for him. Not yet. But she took one step closer and said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Kwon Jae-won's face broke. Not completely, just at the edges. Like a dam that doesn't flood but admits, finally, that the water is real. 2 weeks passed. The company was returned. Every share, the archives, the brand, the legacy, signed back to the Okonkwo family with no conditions except one meeting. Ades came to that meeting expecting papers. She found a garden instead. Jae-won had converted the rooftop of his building into something she didn't have a name for yet. There were flowers she recognized from Lagos, Ixora, deep orange, her mother's favorite, arranged alongside Korean plum blossoms. A small table, 2 chairs, the whole of Seoul burning gold in the afternoon. "You researched my mother's flowers," she said. "I researched everything about you. I told you that already." That was business. This isn't. She sat across from him and the city hummed 40 floors below, and he looked at her like she was the only still thing in a world that never stopped moving. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear it correctly." She waited. "In 61 years, I have never asked anyone to stay. Not because I was too proud, but because no one ever made me understand what staying meant." Her heart moved before her face did. "I'm not a good man nowadays. I've done things that can't be undone. My world is dangerous and expensive and complicated. I have enemies on 3 continents and skeletons in rooms that don't even appear on the building plans." "I'm not asking you to confess," she said. "No, I'm asking if you'll come back. Not for business. Not for any reason I can justify on paper." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because when you sat in that room of 12 dangerous men and raised your chin and said what you said, I felt something I thought I'd killed in myself a long time ago." "What did you feel?" "Hope," he said simply. "I felt hope." She didn't say yes. Not immediately. She went back to Lagos, back to the company, back to her sister, back to the ground floor where her grandmother had once woven fabric with calloused, beautiful hands. She stood in the silence of the old factory and thought about a Korean man who'd split his knuckles over his dead brother and grown ixora flowers on a Seoul rooftop for a woman he'd known 2 weeks. She thought about what she'd told him. The truth about her choice, her waiting, her years of refusing to fold herself into the shape of someone else's convenience. And then she thought about what she hadn't told him. At 31, she had loved someone. A man from Port Harcourt, kind, gentle, everything her mother had approved of. He had died 11 days before their wedding. A car accident on the Lagos-Ibadan expressway on a Tuesday morning that should have been ordinary. She had not told anyone, not even Chisholm, that the reason she hadn't loved again wasn't only discipline or dignity or waiting for the right person. It was because grief, when it goes that deep, rewires something fundamental. She hadn't been saving herself. She had been protecting herself. And now a man with an empire and cracked knuckles and dead brother grief and 40-year-old wounds was asking her to come back. She picked up her phone. She typed 3 words. "I'm coming back." Seoul in winter is different from Seoul in autumn. Harder. Quieter. The cold comes in off the Han River with intention, like it's trying to tell you something. Adaze arrived at Incheon Airport on a Thursday evening, and Jaewon was there himself. Not a driver, not an assistant. Him. In a dark coat, hands in his pockets, standing like a man who had learned how to look calm in situations where he was not calm at all. She saw him before he saw her, and for 3 seconds she watched him, scanning the arrivals hall, jaw slightly tight, the way people look when they're pretending they aren't anxious. When his eyes found hers, something in his face released. She walked to him. He said, "You came." She said, "I told you I was coming." People say things. I don't. He nodded slowly, like a man filing away a fact he intended to rely on for a long time. "Are you hungry?" "Famished." "Good. I cooked." She stopped walking. "You cooked. Is that surprising? You run a criminal empire and 4 multinational companies. Doenjang jjigae, fermented soybean stew. My mother taught me. I've made it exactly twice in my life, and both times were bad." He paused. "Tonight will be the 3rd. She laughed. It was the first time he'd heard it. Full and real and unguarded, rolling out of her like something she'd forgotten she was carrying. He looked at her like a man memorizing something he was terrified of losing. 3 months into whatever they were to each other. Something that lived between friendship and devotion. Something neither of them had named yet, because naming it meant it could be taken. The past arrived at Jaewon's door in the form of a woman. Song Yoo-jin. She was 70 now, immaculate and cold as a jade statue. She had married well, buried one husband, divorced another, and accumulated a fortune of her own. She appeared at a charity gala Jae-won attended with Adaz. And when she saw them together, the way they stood in a room, the unconscious gravity that pulled them toward each other, something moved behind her ancient, calculating eyes. She approached. Jae-won. He went still in a way Adaz had never seen. Yoojin. You look well, better than well. Her eyes moved to Adaz, with the precision of a scalpel. And this must be the Lagos woman everyone is talking about. Dr. Adaz Okonkwo, Adaizi said, extending her hand. And you are? Yoojin's smile didn't reach anything above her lips. An old friend. The ones who matter always introduce themselves properly. The silence that followed had weight. Yoojin turned back to Jae-won. I need to speak with you, privately, about your father's estate. There are documents you haven't seen, things you deserve to know. Anything you need to say to me can be said in front of Dr. Okonkwo. Yoojin raised an eyebrow. It concerns your family's legacy, Jae-won. Things that go back decades. Then it concerns me. And she stays. For the first time, something flickered across Yoojin's face. Not anger. Fear. What Yoojin revealed that night tore through everything like a fire through paper. Jae-won's father and the man he'd mourned, the man whose murder he'd spent 20 years avenging, had not been killed by a rival crime family. He had been killed by his own most trusted advisor, a man named Kwon Dae-sung, his uncle, who was still alive, still wealthy, still sitting on boards and attending state dinners and shaking hands with presidents. And Yoojin had known. She had known at 23 when she chose his father's money over the young man in love with her. She had chosen to protect herself from the man who had power over life and death in that family. She hadn't chosen safety over Jae-won. She had chosen survival. She was weeping now, not prettily but honestly, in a way that made her look her age and her fear simultaneously. I was 23 years old and I was terrified. I'm sorry I have been sorry for 40 years. Jae-won didn't speak for a long time. Then he looked at Adaz. She was watching him, not with pity, with the same steady presence she always carried, the kind that didn't try to fix pain but simply agreed to stand inside it with you. He looked back at Yoojin. Thank you for telling me, he said quietly. Now leave. He didn't speak for an hour after. They drove back to the penthouse in silence. Adaiz didn't fill it. She understood that some silences needed to breathe. When they arrived, he stood at the floor-to-ceiling window and stared at the city for a long time. Then he said, My whole life was built on a wrong foundation. She came to stand beside him. No, she said, it was built on what you had. That's not the same thing. I spent 40 years being angry at the wrong people. You spent 40 years surviving. That counts. He turned to look at her. How are you so steady? I'm not, she said honestly. I lost the man I was going to marry when I was 31. I spent 2 decades pretending I was choosing to wait when actually I was choosing to hide. I built a whole philosophy around my fear and called it dignity. He stared at her. Ada, I'm telling you because you told me the truth about your 23. This is my 31. They stood in the silence of that exchange, 2 people who had just handed each other the most undefended version of themselves. He reached out, slowly, with the same deliberate care he gave everything that mattered, and took her hand. Not passionately, not dramatically, just firmly, like a man who had decided. I'm not going to rush you, he said. I'm not going to ask you for anything you're not ready to give, but I need you to know I see you Adaiz, not the PhD, not the company, not the eloquence or the dignity. You. The woman who hid her grief inside her strength for 20 years. That woman. I see her. Something she had been holding for a very long time came loose in her chest. She leaned her forehead against his shoulder, and he wrapped an arm around her, careful and certain, like a man finally home after a journey that took half a lifetime. The ceremony was not large. Jae-won had offered her half of Seoul, and she had chosen a garden in Lagos, her family's compound. the same yard where her grandfather had planted the first fabric pattern into the ground and called it a beginning. She wore a gown in Okonkwo deep blue, hand-woven in the factory by women who had worked there for 30 years. Her grandmother's gold bracelet on her right wrist, as always. He wore a traditional Korean hanbok in midnight navy that his mother had sent from Busan with a note that simply said, "Don't ruin this." He hadn't. When the officiant asked if he took Adaeze Okonkwo as his wife, he said, before the question was fully finished, yes, unreservedly, without condition. And when the officiant asked Adaeze, she looked at this man, 61 years of storms, 40 years of walls, one cracked knuckle moment in a Seoul hallway, and 3 words, "I'm coming back," and said, "The wait is over." In the front row, Chisholm wept the way only sisters can weep, loud and grateful and completely unashamed. At the reception, someone asked Jaewon, a journalist inevitably, what it felt like to fall in love at 61. He thought for a moment. Then he said, "It feels like I didn't fall. I arrived." That night, in the Lagos compound, under a sky full of stars that looked nothing like Seoul and everything like home, Adaeze Okonkwo, now Kwon, sat beside the man who had seen her, truly seen her, not past her age or her silence or her grief or her waiting. She looked up at the stars. She thought of her mother. She thought of the boy from Port Harcourt. She thought of her grandfather's flag of fabric. And she understood, finally, completely, in the way that only comes after the long road, that waiting hadn't been weakness. It had been preparation. The world had been getting her ready for a room in Seoul, a crack-knuckle silence, and a man who grew ixora flowers 40 floors above a city just to tell her, "I see you." It had been worth every single year. Some love stories begin early. The rare ones begin exactly on time.